This is the new Vivo X300 Pro Global version, and this is the Chinese version of the Vivo X300 Pro. In this video, we will compare the photo and video capabilities of these two very similar Vivos. Well friends, let's get started. Hey friends, this video was translated using AI, so the sound quality isn't perfect. If you prefer to listen to the original sound and hear the audio recording test, just follow the link in the description. Also, some very important information before we start our comparison. My global version of Vivo was released for the CIS region, not the EU. It's pretty much the same global Vivo X300 Pro, the only difference is battery capacity and a lack of Zeiss branding. I'll talk about it in more detail later. And now, let's get to our review. Our smartphones are charged to 100%. Let's go film. Friends, and as tradition dictates, our first test is the 4K 60 FPS front-facing camera on both smartphones. How does my face even look when we're shooting in very simple conditions? It's golden hour now. I'm in the shade. I'm gonna step in the sunlight now. Let's see how our front cameras work. But in general, it seems to me, ideally everything should just look good, because visually, I see that the pictures look very similar on both front cameras. And there are absolutely no problems at all. Here's what my face looks like on both smartphones when the sunset is behind me, and here's what my face looks like if, you're shooting against the light. The footage really looks extremely similar. This is expected as the smartphones have identical front-facing cameras. However, interestingly, there is a slight difference in color reproduction. On the left, the image is a bit darker and the skin looks tanned, while on the right, the video is brighter and the skin is rosy. I can't say anything about the video quality. The cameras have the same level of detail. In the stabilization test, both front cameras performed very poorly. There's a significant amount of background shake. Unfortunately, Vivo just can't seem to fix this problem. Okay, and now I've enabled Dolby Vision on both smartphones. This is the kind of image we get when we record with the Dolby Vision mode on the front camera. Now I have 1x zoom, meaning I've zoomed in on my face a little bit so that the image looks normal. And this is what a stunning sunset looks like when shooting in Dolby Vision on both smartphones. When shooting with extended dynamic range against the light, we get two slightly different images. On the right, the picture is very contrasting, bright and cool, with a greenish tint in the sky and on the sand, for example. Skin tones are orange. On the left, the picture is softer, warmer, with a rosy skin tone. When shooting with bright light, the color reproduction situation doesn't change. Now I've switched to this style. It's called cool, or cold. I'm using it with a portrait video effect. And yes, and the color correction of the face immediately became very similar. When shooting in the same color mode, both images are extremely similar in terms of color reproduction. However, the video on the left is darker and more saturated than the one on the right. Incidentally, while moving, it's noticeable that both smartphones don't handle the blurring effect very confidently, and unblurred sections periodically appear in the video around my face. I also tried switching to a different color profile, and at the same time, seeing how the smartphones handle focusing when there are multiple people in the frame. I want to shift the focus on the girls now, so I'm tapping on them. Now, I tapped on Masha. Now on her. Yes. And now, in theory, now I'm supposed to be out of focus, I think. And they're supposed to be in focus. But I'm seeing again that the frame is on my face. I can tap on them like this, and now they're in focus. I'm tapping here now too. They've come into focus, and I'm completely out of focus. Both smartphones performed identically when changing focus. The focus transition happens smoothly, but the foreground when out of focus looks very strange. It doesn't resemble a realistic blur, more like untextured 3D model surfaces. What's cool is that Vivo allows you to choose different color correction presets in portrait mode and still record with any of them at 4K 60 FPS. I already mentioned that the front cameras on the smartphones are identical, and to be more precise, the X300 Pro is equipped with a 50-megapixel front module with an f2.0 aperture and a 1/2.76-inch sensor. By the way, friends, let's immediately know what operating system versions we have installed at the time of filming the tests. Future firmware updates might include changes and improvements, so this is an important detail. Friends, we have a very difficult audio recording test now. I'm right next to the ventilation system. It's very noisy. This is what it looks like. From here, the air blows out very loudly. Very loudly. And how can you generally hear me? Let's check now without voice enhancement. 1, 2, 3. Mic check. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Mic check. Without boosted audio, both smartphones perform roughly the same in these conditions. Despite the very strong noise, I can still be heard, which is quite good for mobile microphones. And now I'm enabling voice enhancement. That's interesting now. How do I sound now? 1, 2, 3, mic check. 1, 2, 3, mic check. 1, 2, 3. When the voice is boosted, the sound becomes quieter in the Chinese version. But I wouldn't say I'm heard better. And on the second smartphone, the voice didn't become clearer or louder either. Now we're recording everything around us using the main camera block. Let's start with the ultra-wide. In terms of color reproduction, everything looks very similar so far. I can only note that the video on the left is a bit darker and more contrasty. There are no visible differences in quality either. In the camera stabilization test, they both react identically, and in both videos, we see shaking and blur. Here's how the smartphones perform when shooting with a wide-angle lens in 4K 60 FPS. Ultra-wide lens on both Vivos. When filming myself, the difference in image brightness is more noticeable. The video on the left is definitely darker, the one on the right is brighter, but I can't identify any other differences so far. Both smartphones performed uncertainly again during the run. There's background wobble and slight blur. We're shooting everything around us with the main lens. Now the image looks absolutely identical. The phones perform quite well during a run. The video is smooth, with no blur or shakiness. Now, we're switching to the main lens in 4K 60 FPS on both smartphones. I hope I'm in the frame, and the Vivo doesn't crop me out. I'm shooting with my arms stretched out, filming in 4K 60 FPS with both smartphones. I hope again the image turns out good. We see people running on the beach. When filming ourselves against the light, we see that the video on the left is slightly darker than on the right. There are no other noticeable differences between the results. With the stabilization test, both Vivo phones perform well again. When we switch to 2x zoom, we again get identical results, both while walking and running. So, there's no point in lingering on this test. Let's move on. Now let's move on to the portrait video mode. With background blur effect, the lens is 1x, 4K 60 frames per second. The main lens. This is what the picture looks like. The sun is already setting, it's already gone below the horizon. But I hope that the cameras will be able to handle this kind of challenging footage. This is how the blurring looks. I currently have it at f2.8. The color profile is cool. You can adjust it like this. Here we're getting footage when shooting towards the light. When the light is coming from here. And then like this, when shooting against the light. Here's how the image looks now. If you shoot against the light, with a background blur effect, when shooting with the light or against the light, we see almost identical videos from both smartphones. There are minor differences in brightness and white balance, but they're really slight. Both Vivo devices performed confidently during the running test, and there are no differences between them here. We also filmed tracking shot around a person. This is the most challenging portrait photography test. Even though the filming was already done in not the best lighting conditions at sunset, both Vivo phones handled the task excellently. There's not much of a difference visible in the results. Maybe a slightly different image brightness, and that's it. Let's move on to the enhanced stabilization test. In our previous test, the Vivo X300 Pro performed exceptionally well in this mode. By the way, we compared that Vivo with the new Honor Magic 8 Pro and Oppo Find X9 Pro back then. If you haven't seen that battle of flagships yet, you'll find a link in the description. When it comes to stabilization in our tests, there's absolutely no difference between the two Vivo phones. There's no difference whether you're shooting with a wide lens or using the telephoto lenses. Okay friends, and now I've turned on scene mode. This is dual recording, when we film ourselves with the front camera, and we immediately capture everything around us. So, I currently have the wide-angle lens set. This is the kind of image we get when shooting in this mode. So when the front camera is shooting, and the ultra-wide is shooting at the same time, that way you can show how beautiful things are around you. For example, a cool concert, when you want to share your emotions. In this mode, there aren't any significant differences visible again. Everything looks extremely similar. Let's see if there are any differences in macro video recording. In terms of zoom and detail, there's no difference whatsoever. I can only note that the smartphones give us a different white balance, which noticeably changes when switching between lenses. But overall, both offer excellent results. Let's move on to the slow motion test. Both Vivo phones allow you to shoot slow motion with the same settings, 4K at 120 FPS or Full HD at 240 FPS. In both cases, the results are very similar. Judge for yourselves. Let's test the video zoom and first see how smooth the zooming is in video mode. I can say that both smartphones work with lens switching identically. There are absolutely no differences visible. When switching from ultra-wide to 1x, and then from the main lens to the telephoto lens, there is a slight shift in white balance, but the stitching looks very smooth and neat, both when zooming in and out. Now, let's move on to the video zoom test. Let's start with the camera specs. The X300 Pro is equipped with a 50MP main camera, an ultra-wide camera with the same resolution, and a 200MP telephoto lens. There are no differences in this regard with the global version. As for the video zoom itself, honestly, I don't see much point in talking about this test. The smartphones performed identically at all zoom levels, and the differences, if any, are mostly in white balance. Both smartphones also offer 8K video, but this mode doesn't provide a significant increase in quality. It's only useful if you're editing videos in 4K or Full HD and want to crop them without losing quality. Now we're enabling Dolby Vision and recording video with extended dynamic range. When shooting with the ultra-wide lens, we get two very similar results. The smartphones handle even bright backlight quite well. When switching to One X, we see that the left side is slightly overexposed compared to the right. However, the Chinese version of the Vivo has a significant horizontal flare in video. If we record in Dolby Vision with the telephoto lens, we get almost identical videos without any distinct differences. Let's test shooting in logarithmic profile right away. For color grading, we simply apply the official LUT from Vivo, which we took from their website. The results are very similar across all zoom levels. We finished with the video tests, and now we're shooting photos. On the global version, we have the standard color profile, natural, and on the Chinese version, we're setting Zeiss. That's one of the main differences between these smartphones. The version for the CIS region I have has absolutely no Zeiss branding anywhere, but the Zeiss shooting modes are still there, they're just called something different. The global version for the EU market, on the other hand, would have all of the Zeiss branding present. That's the only difference here. Let's start with selfies. Let's take the first photo with our whole family. Here, you can see that on the photo on the left, the skin tones came out yellowish or even greenish. For example, my daughter Masha or our beloved grandmother. With the Chinese version of the Vivo, the result in terms of color reproduction is more accurate. The skin looks better. Here's a second selfie, this time just me. The photo on the left came out dark, and my skin looks very tanned. The photo on the right is brighter. My face is better lit, and my skin looks rosy. Another photo with me, but in different lighting conditions. The Chinese Vivo produced a slightly more saturated result than the global version of the smartphone. I also took pictures with the front camera at other zoom levels, 1x and 2x, and the results were the same. As for skin tones, in the photo on the left it's consistently a bit darker, while on the right it's more rosy. Let's move on to portrait selfies. This is one of the weakest modes on the Vivo X300 Pro. Right away, the rough processing of my older daughter Maya's hair is noticeable in both photos, and in the Chinese version of the smartphone, this flaw is compounded by a lack of focus in the right part of the picture. The next photo was taken with 1x zoom, and something strange happened with the selfie on the right here. The background is completely overexposed, it's practically white. If it weren't for the sand behind us, I would have thought I accidentally turned on some kind of filter that cuts out the background. But no, it's an overexposed background. To add to that, there's blur on the left and a crooked haircut, and we get a defective photo. In the photo on the left, the work on the hair is also very shaky, but at least there's no overexposure or blur. Another photo. Again, both Vivo models show poor processing of the blur boundary in my daughter's hair, but at least they managed my hair okay. Let's take one last control photo. Again, on both sides there are errors with the hair. However, Chinese Vivo made one glaring mistake. It didn't blur the area of the shot between me and my wife. Interesting results. The same smartphone, the same front-facing camera, yet different shots. Now we're taking photos of people using the main camera block. There are noticeable difference in color reproduction on the ultra-wide lens. The photo on the left is dark and saturated, which makes the skin tone look strange. For example, my older daughter's face turned out too red. The photo on the right is brighter with a normal skin tone. There are no such differences in the photos taken with the main lens. The photos look very similar. But still, the result on the left is slightly more saturated, and a yellowish tint is noticeable on the skin. Now let's enable the telephoto lenses. There is a slight difference between the results here too. The photo on the left looks a little more washed out than the one on the right. 10x zoom. It's very noticeable how aggressively the smartphones process skin and add details to the images. For example, the eyes. Again, a difference I'm noticing is that the photo on the right is more contrasty than the one on the left. Zooming into 20x. In terms of detail, both photos look identical. And again, the only difference I can point out is the different contrast levels. Second photo shoot. This time I'm in the frame. The same trend is noticeable across all zoom levels. In the photo on the left, the skin tone looks tanned, even a little orange I'd say. At the same time, on the right, we almost always get a rosy result. Although, with greater digital zoom, even the difference in color reproduction becomes minimal. Let's move on to portrait mode and take a photo with digital background blur. Blurred f2.4, we're not changing the color profile. At the initial zoom levels, there are practically no differences between the photos. Regarding blur, both smartphones struggle with fine hair. There are noticeable differences between the shots only when using the telephoto lenses. The result on the right is more contrasty and darker than the one on the left. But that's all the significant differences. It's very noticeable at the highest zoom level how smartphones are adding details to the photo, especially when you look at the eyes. Interestingly, the Chinese version of Vivo seems to be smoothing out details and processing skin more aggressively. Let's see if we get the same results in our next photo shoot. Let's move on to that now. At the first zoom level, there is a slight difference in color reproduction. The image on the left is warmer, and the skin appears reddish. The image on the right is cooler, with a more saturated, turquoise sky. The skin tone does have a slight yellow cast. At the next zoom level, the skin tone looked more accurate, but the sky still appears differently. When switching to larger zoom levels, differences in white balance are noticeable everywhere, although not overly pronounced. As for the bokeh, these smartphones don't have any issues this time around. It's definitely easier for them to work with my hair. At maximum zoom, both Vivo devices apply minimal processing, as the photos were taken from a closer distance this time. We're doing our signature spoon fork test, where we check how the blur algorithms work on thin objects. Both Vivo devices worked flawlessly with the zoom at all levels and showed excellent and confident results. However, I can't highlight any differences between them here. Let's move on to landscape shots. There's a slight difference in brightness in the first photo taken with the ultra-wide lens. The picture on the left is slightly brighter than the one on the right. The same situation applies to the second photo. But here, the difference in brightness is even more noticeable. When switching to the main lens, we see that almost all the photos taken with the Chinese version of the Vivo are brighter and more saturated. I also took a couple of photos with the telephoto lens, and here again, the picture on the left turns out to be slightly lighter than the one on the right. Let's move on to the photo zoom test. I don't think it will be a surprise to anyone that both Vivo devices performed identically in terms of detail at all zoom levels. There's a slight difference in white balance at some zoom levels, but as for the actual photo quality, everything looks very similar. We also took photos at high resolution, but there were no differences in the results there either. Both Vivo models allow us to shoot photos in RAW format. This means photos are saved directly from the smartphone's sensor without processing or color adjustments. For the best quality, I recommend using Super RAW. As for the photos themselves, there's practically no difference between them. Let's move on to a delicious test. We're taking food photos. There are absolutely no differences here. There are two zoom levels, the same styles, everything is identical. I sometimes use the miniature effect for food photography too. Both smartphones have it, but in the Chinese version, it's called the Zeiss miniature effect. There are no differences beyond the name. The photos look incredibly similar, beautiful, and delicious. Let's move on to macro photography. We see a very similar interface, and the only difference isn't that on the left we don't have the Zeiss name again. If we talk about the differences in the photos themselves, there's a slight difference in color reproduction. For example, on the telephoto lens, the photo on the left turned out to be brighter and warmer, while the one on the right is darker and more yellow. On the 7x zoom, conversely, the image on the right is already brighter, while the result on the left is more contrasty and saturated. Color reproduction is the only difference here, and otherwise the photos are practically identical on both smartphones. Now it's nighttime, and we're going to test the photo and video capabilities in low light and artificial lighting conditions. Okay friends, as tradition dictates, our first test is 4K at 30 frames per second using the front-facing camera. I'm standing right now under a light source. Behind me is the beautiful Dubai Marina. It's gorgeous, simply beautiful. The lights are amazing. Everything looks really nice. And, generally speaking, I like the picture quality on both smartphones. And this is how the footage looks when we're facing the light, with our backs to it. The light is shining right here. This is what my face looks like. Of course, it's better to shoot facing the light for this kind of footage. Let's walk a bit and see how stabilization works in 4K 30 FPS on both smartphones. It's noticeable that the global version of Vivo makes skin tones look more yellow than the Chinese version when shooting in normal lighting. When shooting against the light, the smartphones perform identically. Stabilization is poor on both. They both produce a lot of blur and shake. Okay, so now I've enabled 4K 60 FPS on the front camera. I'm standing here now, standing in the light, and I'm being illuminated by a lot of light. It's shining nicely on my face. This is the image we're getting from behind. By the way, I'm recording now at 1x. And now we're gonna try 0.6x. And here's the view when we're shooting with the wide-angle front camera. It's really great that Vivo has this feature, I really like it. Now I'm switching back to 1x. And now I'll show you where we are. So, I have this kind of lighting behind me, which illuminates my face nicely. When shooting at 60 FPS, we see again that the skin tone yellows more on the left side compared to the right. No other differences are noticeable. The stabilization continues to work weakly while running, but at least in 60 FPS, there's no motion blur in the background. Now we're in portrait video mode. And it seems like there's some kind of ripple effect on my face. This is because I have this bright lighting behind me. And you can see that it's flickering. So, ideally you should shoot this in 4K 50 FPS, and then we'll get a decent picture. When shooting in portrait mode, it's noticeable again that the image on the left is more yellow than the right. And when shooting against the light, both Vivo phones perform identically. There are no differences during a run either. The video looks roughly the same. Let's switch to the main camera block and record everything around using the ultra-wide lens. There's absolutely no discernible difference in the video quality at all. The images are identical in terms of color reproduction and quality. During a run, they also perform almost identically. The stabilization is shaky and produces some blur. When switching to 60 FPS, again, there's no difference between the smartphones, so we won't spend too much time on this test. This is what the recording looks like when shooting in 4K at 30 frames per second on the ultra-wide lens. Actually, there's quite a lot of light here. I hope my face is well lit, and that you can see me okay. By the way, there are also some little lights here to illuminate. And like this, my face is also illuminated well. And there's a light behind me too. 4K at 30 frames per second. Our lens is set to 0.6x. Filming myself. Hopefully there are no problems. And the image turns out really great. This is what my face looks like when shooting in 4K at 60 frames per second. We're currently using a 0.6x lens. I'm approaching the sign specifically, which illuminates my face. Hopefully the image is pleasing overall. And this is what it looks like when we'll be shooting against the light, when the lighting behind me is better than on my face. When filming ourselves, we see two identical pictures, whether walking or running, whether at 30 FPS or 60 FPS. Overall, both ultra-wide cameras perform practically the same. Now let's film everything around us using the main lens. Here, I can only note the different white balance. The image on the right is yellowish, while the image on the left is reddish. The stabilization test showed no differences. The smartphones perform identically. When recording video at 60 FPS, the white balance is roughly the same. And now, even the color reproduction looks indistinguishable. Okay friends, here is what the picture looks like when shooting 4K at 30 FPS with the main lens. So, Vivo without Zeiss, and Vivo with Zeiss. When shooting myself, both with the light behind and in front of me, we see some differences in color reproduction and brightness. The video on the left is darker, and the skin tones are richer than in the video on the right. However, in the stabilization test, the smartphones performed identically. There are no differences in that regard. Okay, so now I've turned on 4K 60 FPS 1x lens. Again, in theory, the lamps here should light me well. This is what the footage looks like when shooting towards the light. This is what the video looks like when shooting against the light. But even so, these small lamps are shining on my face, so I think the conditions here are generally very good. When activating 60 FPS, we again see a slight color difference between the two videos. For example, on the left, the skin tone appears more tanned, while on the right, it more rosy. In terms of stabilization, there are no changes this time, we see identical results. Now, let's move on to portrait videos. When we have background blur, 4K 60 frames per second. Let's see how it handles this kind of shooting. It's especially nice when the background blurs so well up here. Does it look good? I'm deliberately positioning myself now, because the lighting is really good here. I'm lit from the left. That's really nice. Ideally, the image should look absolutely gorgeous. And now let's see how our smartphones perform in such challenging conditions, when there's actually very little light. I don't really have much to say about this test either. The images look great and are very similar to each other. In the stabilization test, both Vivo devices performed confidently, and there are no differences between them. We also filmed a tracking shot around the person, but the smartphones handled that equally well too. We did a dual recording video test under these conditions, but as with the daytime test, I can't see any significant difference in the results. Now let's move on to the nighttime video zoom test. Again, like in the daytime test, the smartphones produce pretty much the same image in terms of detail and quality across all available zoom levels. The differences are noticeable only in color reproduction, but we've already talked about this in previous tests, so let's move on to the next one. I also shot some nighttime time lapses. They look great, but again, I can't spot any differences between the two results. We've finished with the video night tests, now we're moving on to photos, starting with selfies. The very first photo shows us quite a different color rendition. The photo on the right is very bright and warm, the skin tone has a reddish hue. The one on the left is yellowish and darker. The second selfie shows a similar situation. Now a photo of just me. Here, the color difference isn't as noticeable. However, the one on the left is still slightly darker than the one on the right. And one more photo in more challenging conditions. There are slight differences in white balance. The one on the left is greenish, while the one on the right has a bluish tint. Let's take some portrait selfies. The first photo differs again only in color reproduction. The left image turned out more saturated than the Chinese version result. The subsequent photos, however, were practically identical, with only minor differences in white balance. Both Vivo models exhibit slight imperfections in the blur boundary. Let's move on to shooting people with the main camera block. We use a Zeiss profile on the Chinese Vivo and a natural profile on the global version. Photos from the ultra-wide lens turned out to be slightly different. The result on the left is more saturated and contrasting, while the right is calmer and brighter. A similar situation is seen on the main lens as well. There aren't any significant changes here. Photos from the telephoto lens also look quite similar. The differences between the results are minimal. At 10x, both smartphones actively utilize photo enhancements, but the Chinese version of Vivo has more aggressive processing. The skin is smoothed out more, and more details are lost. A similar situation occurs at 20x zoom as well. Pay attention, for example, to the hair or eyebrows. The details are decent on the left side, but much more blurred on the right. The second photo session has me in the frame. There are difference in color reproduction again on the ultra-wide lens. The left image is dark and saturated, while the one on the right is brighter and softer. Let's move on to the main camera. Here the results are more similar to each other and there's only a slight difference in white balance. When shooting with the telephoto lens, we again see a difference in the brightness of the photos, as we did with the ultra-wide. A similar situation occurs with 10 times zoom, and I can't identify any other differences in the photos. Let's move on to portrait shots. We're keeping the lighting profile unchanged. In the photo taken with the main lens, you can see that the left side is yellowish, while the right side isn't. The same situation occurs with the next zoom level. Again, the left photo is slightly more yellow. I'm also noting that the Chinese version of Vivo boosts the exposure more, and the photo looks brighter. On the next zoom, we see a similar situation. There's not much to add here. Let's move on to the telephoto lenses. There are some differences in the blurring. On the left, the smartphone blurred a lot of fine hairs on my daughter's head, for example, around the ear. There's also a noticeable difference in color reproduction. On the right, the photo is brighter, and the skin tone is rosy, not too saturated. On the left, the photo is darker, the skin is more saturated, tanned, with a yellowish tint. Other differences include skin processing. The Chinese version of Vivo smoothed my face more aggressively and erased fine wrinkles. At the highest zoom, the results differ quite a bit. Firstly, in the photo on the right, part of the building in the background isn't fully blurred, while in the photo on the left we see a complete blur of the background. Also, the Chinese version of Vivo didn't handle the space between my head and my daughter's head well. The boundary of the hair blur looks rough. And here, it's even more apparent that the Chinese smartphone smooths skin more and removes finer details. Let's move on to shooting everything around. In the first photo, with the ultra-wide lens, there's a slight difference in brightness. The photo on the left is a bit darker than the one on the right. In the following shots, the only difference I can note is a minor difference in white balance. Overall, the photos are similar in both quality and how they handle light sources. Let's switch to the main lens. It's already difficult to see even slight differences between the shots here. They all look extremely similar, almost identical. I also took photos with a telephoto lens, and in the first shots there are noticeable difference in color. The left photo is yellowish and darker than the one on the right. However, on the following pairs of photos, these differences are no longer visible. Now we're testing one of the most interesting modes, long exposure photography. Both Vivo offer identical presets for creating such impressive photos, and as a result, we get cool and striking images. Let's move on to the low-light photo zoom test. I can't identify any differences between the photos on all the initial zoom levels, so there's no point in stopping at each zoom. The differences only appeared at 10x. On the photo on the left, the flare around the light sources was stronger, and that made the text less readable. A similar situation occurred at 20x. Again, the photo on the left is brighter, and consequently, the illuminated sign is brighter and overexposed. We see a similar situation on the 20x zoom and at the maximum 100x zoom. On the left, there's a brighter halo around the letters, while on the right, it's almost invisible, but the photo as a whole is darker. Now let's take RAW photos. Both smartphones allow you to take RAW. It's this mode that I recommend using in such challenging conditions. The photos themselves turn out to be extremely similar. They're easy to edit, and you can easily bring out bright areas and shadows. Overall, there are no significant differences between the smartphones in this respect. Well friends, let's see how much battery we have left after the filming. Now here's the expected result. Both smartphones hold their charge equally, with a 1% difference. The batteries in both smartphones are absolutely identical. Both are 6,510 mAh. But here's another big difference between the global version of Vivo I bought and the one that is targeting EU. In the European version, the battery is only 5,440 mAh due to regulations. Now let's talk about the display. The X300 Pro features an AMOLED panel with a 6.78-inch diagonal and a resolution of 2800 by 1260 pixels. Just out of curiosity, we measured the brightness and PWM, and the results were practically identical. Let's see if there are any differences in performance. The X300 Pro uses a MediaTek Dimensity 9500 processor and an ARM G1 Ultra GPU. We'll run a performance test using Antutu. The Chinese Vivo completed the test slightly faster and also scored more points, although the difference was minimal. Let's move on to Geekbench. In the processor test, the global version of the Vivo finished slightly faster and scored a bit more points than the Chinese version. Meanwhile, the GPU test, on the other hand, was completed faster by the Chinese Vivo, which also scored a few more points. The 3D Mark stability test yielded somewhat different results. On the left, we see stability at 47%, and on the right, it's higher, 51.6%. The result is that the Chinese Vivo turned out to be slightly more productive and stable. Perhaps this is just a margin of error, or maybe it's different system optimization. What do you think, friends? Write in the comments. And we're moving on. As we know, Vivo is known for its wide variety of features for taking photos, and we already know from experience that in previous versions of smartphones for the global market, they cut back on some shooting modes. For example, the global version of the Vivo X200 Pro didn't have the same variety in filters as the Chinese version. Let's see if there are any differences in our Vivo X300 Pro. One of the most noticeable differences, which we already mentioned, is the complete absence of the Zeiss logo. However, the Zeiss modes themselves remain. Vivo simply removed their branding. And again, the Zeiss branding is still present in the EU version of the device. But what really differs are the AI features. As we can see, the global version doesn't have AI visual at all. This feature is only available in the Chinese version of the smartphone. It includes face retouching presets for portrait mode, as well as filters for landscape photography. However, these features only work with an internet connection, as the processing of these images seems to happen on Vivo servers. This is actually a big problem. My family and I are currently in Dubai, and no matter how many times have I tried using filters here, they constantly freeze at 10% loading and then show an error. As a result, I simply can't use them. Other differences include more bokeh presets in the Chinese version of the Vivo, and there are also this portrait effect mode where the smartphone offers a lot of pre-made settings for portrait photography. Otherwise, there are no differences in the camera settings. Let's test network speed and start with Wi-Fi. We took several measurements connecting the smartphones to the network one by one. Ultimately, both showed roughly similar results with minor differences, around 600-650 megabits for download and 200-250 megabits for upload. Now let's move on to mobile internet. It's important to note that I'm in Dubai and testing the network speed on the same carrier and plan. And here, there's a noticeable speed difference between the smartphones. The global model consistently holds up to 1000 megabit per second and sometimes even more, while the Chinese version caps out at 500 to 600 megabit per second. The reason for this is that the global version has additional international FDD bands, including B32 and B71, which are necessary for proper frequency aggregation in Dubai. There are also extended 5G frequency support like N71 and N75. This allows the device to gather more extensive combinations of multiple bands, which is what delivers that gigabit download speed. The Chinese version simply can't do that. It lacks some of the global frequencies and is optimized for Chinese carriers. Since we have versions for different regions, there are some differences in the operating system as well. Both run on Origin OS, but the pre-installed apps and some other elements are different. The version for my region has locally installed apps. I'll also note that all Google services are pre-installed here, which is definitely a plus. At the same time, on this Chinese Vivo, we see a lot of Chinese apps that you'll have to delete manually. There are no Google services at all here. You'll have to download and install them yourself. By the way, we already have a detailed tutorial on our channel with a full setup guide for Vivo smartphones. I showed everything there in maximum detail, step by step. So, if you do decide to get a Chinese version, be sure to check out our tutorial. Let's get back to our comparison. There are also differences in system customization. As expected, the Chinese version offers a multitude of widgets in Chinese. Here, we see applications like Blue LM Copilot, the Smart Assistant Jovi, and other features that are simply absent in the global Vivo version. If we go into the settings menu, we'll notice another important difference at the bottom. The global version doesn't have the Blue AI option. That makes sense because Vivo AI is developed specifically for the Chinese market and simply doesn't work well in other countries. Since we're talking about AI features, let's see what other things both smartphones offer in that regard. Both Vivo phones have a feature to remove objects from photos called AI retouching, but it works differently. We see that in our global version, there's no object highlighting at all. There's only an option to erase and a color adjustment setting. And indeed, the smartphone doesn't highlight the object or attempt to remove it, but simply smears areas of the photo by copying other areas. It's like a tool from Photoshop, such as the spot healing brush. The Chinese version of Vivo prompts you to download a large model for removing objects from images before you start. Okay, let's go ahead and download, then we move on to the deletion process and see two new menu items, Smart Selection and Removal of People. The phone handled the selection of our fruit without any problems, but instead of deleting it, I just replaced it with some chocolate egg. Or what is that, friends? Write your guesses in the comments. It took the algorithm's 3 attempts to remove the fruit from my hand, but for some reason, my hand had 4 fingers, even though I'm sure I have 5. I literally checked today. Alright, that's pretty much everything that sets them apart, friends. If I missed anything, please write it in the comments. We really do read everything. Let's wrap things up, and as per tradition, we'll start with the prices. I bought the Chinese version of the Vivo X300 Pro with 256 gigabytes for about $890, and the new X300 Pro, released for my region with 512 gigabytes of storage, cost me about $930. It's important to note that the version for my region is only sold with 512 gigabytes of storage, so we'll be comparing its price to that of the Chinese X300 Pro with the same storage capacity. A Chinese version of the Vivo can currently be purchased for a price starting from $925. The difference is minor. What's better to choose then? There are many differences between the smartphones, but they do exist. One of the most important and key factors is connecting smartwatches with Wear OS. There have always been issues with that regarding Chinese Vivo. Many Wear OS watches simply can't be connected. And it's not all smooth sailing with gadgets from other manufacturers either. The exception is Samsung watches, but connecting them is a real hassle. But even if the connection is successful, you might still have problems with notifications on the watch. In the version for my region, there are no such problems. Everything connects easily and works perfectly. However, there's an important nuance. When connecting Samsung watches, for example, you must first install the branded app and log into your account. The same goes for connecting Xiaomi watches and watches from other manufacturers. In that case, everything will work without problems. When it comes to photo and video recording, throughout the entire video we observed an interesting picture. Color reproduction can vary depending on certain conditions and lenses. Typically, the global version of Vivo tends to produce a yellowish and darker result, and it makes skin tones appear tanned, whereas with the Chinese version, we more often get a lighter, warmer result with a pinkish skin tone. However, in terms of image quality, the smartphones deliver identical results in all tests. Regarding differences in the camera interface, I can only note the absence of the Zeiss brand name. Yes, this version of the smartphone lacks the actual Zeiss brand, but the modes themselves remain, just with different names. Here's what's really missing in the global version: the AI features. This applies to both the cameras and the system as a whole. The camera lacks portrait and landscape filters, and there's no proper tool for removing objects from photos. To be honest, it's not really critical. Vivo's filters also work over the internet, and while I was in Dubai, they simply wouldn't upload photos to the cloud and gave me an error. A similar situation might exist in other regions. Write in the comments, friends, if anyone has a Chinese Vivo. The object removal tool, however, works very poorly, so I wouldn't say its absence is a significant loss. The system itself lacks the smart assistants Jovi and Blue AI, but that's not critical either, because those assistants are designed exclusively for China, and they're essentially not interesting to us. What else can be noted regarding the operating system? Of course, the pre-installed software. The smartphone comes with a ton of pre-installed apps right out of the box, but most importantly, it already has all the Google services, whereas with the Chinese Vivo, you initially don't have Google services, not even the Gboard keyboard. The phone is filled with a lot of Chinese apps. You can remove all of this, customize it, but the procedure isn't quick and has its own nuances, which I also covered in our instructions. And as I already mentioned, both X300 Pro run on Origin OS. I'd really like that, because previously, Vivo used FunTouch OS for smartphones on the global market. I honestly didn't like it at all. Another important difference in the Chinese version is the slower internet speed in mobile networks outside of China. Even with a gigabit network, the Chinese Vivo managed to achieve a maximum download speed of 600 megabits, whereas the global smartphone reached over 1000 megabits. We already discussed in the mobile network test that this is due to support for different frequencies and network ranges. That concludes the key differences between the smartphones. So, which one would I choose for myself? Of course, it's the global version of the Vivo X300 Pro, friends. It costs about the same as the Chinese version, but it's much more comfortable and convenient to use right out of the box. Google services are present, connecting smartwatches is seamless, and there are no hassles with installing keyboards or removing all the Chinese software. Overall, this version of Vivo really impressed me. What would you choose for yourselves, friends? Write in the comments. And that is all for now. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and bye-bye everyone.